So they're all going to get together, and they may have a new currency, an SDR or a bank core or something like that, and it won't be backed by gold, so it'll be worthless, just like all the other currencies. The only exception being the euro is slightly backed by gold, probably about 7%. So they'll have this meeting, revaluation, devaluation, and default, and maybe institute a new international currency or trading unit. And we've yet to see.
Yeah, I was coming to that, the Bancor. That's something I was going to bring up later. I noticed that, speaking of the Middle East and the oil situation, is going to be affected greatly as it was in Iraq, as it is now. But today, from Bloomberg, it mentions that crude oil has fallen below $77 after U.S. supplies increase. Economic outlook dims. Crude oil declined for a third day after U.S. jobless claims increased, bolstering concern that economic growth will be slow and fuel demand will drop. It's my feeling that this it's not going to be slow. It's just the actual recovery is not going to happen. Is this the big one?
I don't know. As far as oil is concerned, could very well be. Because the minute a war starts, no matter how short a duration, and I don't think it'll be a short duration, they need a long war. Because they got to grind the world down and kill as many people as they can. I mean, that's their outlook on it. And so, yes, oil could go to $150 or $200 a barrel. And how long it'll stay there remains to be seen. If it's a long war, you stay there indefinitely. And so, and it all depends, too, on whether they use nuclear weapons. And if they do, well, maybe the war would end sooner, but on the other hand, maybe it would proliferate, too. And I think the Chinese and the Russians will be involved in a big way. And the Russians, I don't really think want to be involved, but the Chinese don't care because they got 1.4 billion people, and they want to get rid of half of them. And that would be a legitimate way of doing it, plus continue to increase their hold on the Chinese people.
Well, the Chinese job market itself is booming, but the plan is, the agenda is, has always been to de-industrialize the West and throw all the factories into China and India and various other developing countries, shall we say. They like to call them developing countries. And at the expense of the taxpayers themselves. If you're a company and you have to shut up shop and move to China, you're covered for 10 years by the taxpayer's pocket. But today I noticed from Bloomberg, China tests to check risk of cash crunch among developers. Chinese stress tests of banks will assess the risk that a possible slump in property prices may strain developers' finances and cause home buyers to default. A person with knowledge of the matter said. I love that. It's always an expert said, or a person with knowledge of the matter said. So there's a few kind of creaking doors in China as well. It's built up, the Illuminati and the bankers themselves have built up China as the model for the 21st century, along with places like India, and the West is to be destroyed, and austerity, whatever. But what are these stress tests of the banks? Can you explain a bit more about that in China?
Well, the banks are directed by governments to follow a certain criteria in finding out what their assets and liabilities are. And the banks do their own stress tests, which means that you're getting a very subjective view. Plus, all the banks are carrying two sets of books, so the stress test is worthless.
Right. It's just theater for the public?
Yeah, just for public consumption.
I see.
You know, it wasn't but 2 days ago that the European Central Bank, which is the bank for the Eurozone, which is 16 countries out of the 27 countries in the European Union. And they didn't ask them, they told Germany, you are going to assume the assets and liabilities of Hypobank and Westlandbank, West LD as it's called. And they have to put those on the books now. And that means that the debt to GDP is going to jump from 62% of GDP, and the Maastricht guideline is 60 or less, which
right.
they're already over. It's going to kick it up to 90%. And that'll be where the U.S. is next year, without having counted in things like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And, the U.S. is looking at 150% of GDP. And the only one that can do any worse than that as a major country is Japan. And the figure is 250 or 350 or something like that. The only saving factor for...
Yeah, carry on, please.
The only saving factor for Japan is that almost all the debt is to Japanese citizens in yen.
Well, we're led to believe that the stock markets have always been like a casino, a ship that's prey to the currents and the buffeting waves of an unpredictable sea. Now we know that's a lie, that the markets are far from unpredictable, that they, like the oil prices, are managed, and the privileged insider information makes huge booty for banksters on the Wall Street. Every time I know you're on Alex Jones every Friday. Every time I hear you talk about gold, and it seems to hit a new record. And now there is mounting evidence to suggest that the gold and silver markets are rigged too. I mean, what's the reason for this? I mean, why allow their number one commodity to be high now? Is it the last? Is this the last shot across the bow of the dollar?
Probably you could put it that way. Since, in my knowledge, I've been in this for over 50 years, and I owned a stock brokerage firm. I was the largest gold-silver stockbroker in the world. So yeah. I've been on Wall Street. And the reason they try to affect the value of gold, because gold is an alternative to the U.S. dollar, the reserve currency. And if gold goes up in value, then people will question the value of the dollar and other currencies as well. That's been going on against the dollar for 7 years, and then 5 years versus other currencies. First 6 months of this year, the dollar and the Swiss franc were off, and the pound were off approximately 13% versus gold. So if they do the same thing the second half of the year, then it'll be over 25%, which it's been every year for the last 9 or 10 years. And right. Gold is a barometer. When gold goes up, it tells you that there's some very, very serious economic problems or financial problems. And they try to keep gold price down. Now, they started manipulating in the middle 60s, and I didn't really realize it until about 5 years ago, what they were doing. And then in August of '88, Mr. Reagan signed an executive order creating the President's Group on Financial Markets. And that was to keep another October the 19th, 1987 from happening. Well, Mr. Reagan is now with his maker, and we still have the executive order, which has been distorted, in which the Treasury and the Fed, the SEC and the CFTC and the New York Fed, they use that as an excuse to manipulate every market